Just blood family only, stepdad texted. I said, okay, no problem. He had no idea I owned a $6 million Big Sur Cliff House. I flew in everyone they'd cut off. Hours later, after stepdad saw our Easter photos on Instagram without them, my phone blew up. 57 missed calls. Let me tell you exactly how we got there. Because the Instagram post is not the beginning of this story. The beginning of this story is a wire transfer, a deck overlooking the Pacific, and a word that made something inside me go very quiet and very still. 3 seconds before that text came in, I had finished watching the wire transfer clear. $22,000. That was the number my stepfather, the man I was supposed to call dad, said would keep his auto repair shop from being repossessed by the lender. I had wired it from my phone, standing barefoot on the heated travertine of my pool deck, the Pacific glittering about 1,200 feet below me. The little check mark appeared, sent, and I exhaled. I had been exhaling a version of that breath my entire adult life. The breath that said I showed up again. The breath that said I kept the thing together again. The breath that said maybe this time it'll be different. 3 seconds later, my phone lit up. Easter brunch is going to be at the house this year. Just blood family. Renee's bringing the new baby, and she wants the photos to feel authentic. Hope you understand. I read it 3 times. I was wearing a linen robe over a swimsuit I hadn't gotten into yet. There was condensation on a glass of sparkling water on the side table. A hummingbird was working the bougainvillea behind me. I read it 3 times because the words kept rearranging themselves into different cruelties. Just blood family. After 22 grand wired 3 seconds ago. Authentic. After I co-signed on his shop's first lease when I was 22 years old and stupid with love for the idea of a father. After 31 years of showing up to things I hadn't been wanted at. After driving 4 hours to Thanksgiving to sit at a table where I was never actually at the table. After every birthday he missed and every graduation he half attended, and every time I convinced myself that the next one would be different, that I had finally earned my way into the category of person rather than resource. Hope you understand. I stood there on that deck and I felt something inside my chest go very quiet. Not sad. Past sad, actually. The way a room goes quiet right before the smoke alarm finally screams. Here's what he didn't know. What none of them knew. 2 years ago, in a little office building in Pasadena that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, I signed paperwork that licensed a piece of medical imaging software I had built in my apartment. My apartment, on my laptop, on my time, on my obsession, to a company in Boston. The signing bonus was 8 figures. The royalty stream that followed it was something I wasn't going to say out loud for a long time, but it was enough. It had been enough for a while. I kept driving the same beat-up CRV with the cracked dashboard. I kept wearing old navy jeans to Thanksgiving. I kept showing up to my stepsister Renee's gender reveals with a Target gift card and a casserole dish, standing in her kitchen while she talked past me to people who mattered to her, being useful in the way a countertop is useful, always there, never noticed unless you need it. The moment I stopped being the broke stepdaughter, I would lose the only role they had ever cast me in. And I wasn't ready yet for the fight that would follow. I wasn't ready to find out what happened when I stopped performing the part. Apparently, reading that text on that deck with $22,000 still warm in the send log, I was ready now. My name is Ren. I am 31 years old. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 9, and I want to spend a moment here because she is the reason any of this matters. Her name was Claire. She was 34 when she died, which means she was 25 when she had me, which means for most of my life I've been older than I ever got to know her. She was a graphic designer who worked from home in a room that smelled like coffee and artist markers. She had a laugh that started quiet and built, the way a good joke builds. She was the kind of mother who let me stay up past my bedtime to finish a good chapter, and then climbed into the twin bed next to me and kept reading out loud after I fell asleep, just in case I could still hear it. I have thought about that a lot, just in case I could still hear it. She was diagnosed when I was 7. By 8, I was watching her learn to navigate the house with a hand on the wall. By 9, I was standing at a gravesite in a black dress my grandmother had bought me because my mother hadn't had time to do it herself. My stepfather came 2 years later. His name was Gerald, and he had a daughter from his first marriage named Renee, who was 3 years older than me, and treated me from day one with the particular disdain that only an 11-year-old girl whose father just remarried can produce. Cold, total, and completely invisible to any adult watching. Gerald was charming in the early years, the way people who are good at extracting things are always charming in the early years. He made my grandmother cry at his wedding toast because he said he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure her daughter's daughter was taken care of. I was 10 years old and I heard those words and felt something enormous and fragile open up in my chest. That feeling was accurate, it turned out, just not in the direction I thought. Gerald was not cruel the way a clenched fist is cruel. He was cruel the way erosion is cruel. Slow, constant, barely visible until the whole cliff has changed shape. He never hit anyone. He just made the world around me smaller, year by year, until the only people left were the ones who needed something from him, which meant the only people left were the ones who needed something from me. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, had been my favorite person on earth after my mom. She called every Sunday. She showed up to my school play when no one else did and sat in the front row and cried openly, and I loved her for it completely. She lived 40 minutes away. She was the closest thing I had to my mother still being alive. Gerald got rid of her slowly. The way you get rid of something you can't throw away all at once. You just move it further from reach, until one day you reach for it and it's gone. Canceled visits, forgotten birthdays. Then, at a family wedding when I was 14, a comment delivered in a carrying voice just quiet enough to be deniable. She makes the whole family look low class, working a cafeteria job at 42. Carol had taken that job at the county hospital after her husband got sick. She took it because it came with health insurance that covered his treatments. Gerald said that sentence, went back to his salmon, and that was that. Carol stopped calling as often. I think she thought she was protecting me. My grandfather on my mother's side lost his Christmas invitation when I was 17 for wearing his Vietnam veteran's cap to dinner. Gerald said it was uncouth in that particular tone that had no volume but filled a room completely. My grandfather set down his fork and looked at Gerald for a long time without saying anything, then put on his coat and said his goodbyes and drove home. After that, Christmas was a holiday he wasn't at. Marisol came when I was 9, hired to help with the house. She made the best rice I have ever tasted. She braided my hair. She packed my lunches with little notes that said things like, "Today is a good day for being brave." She worked for 6 years, and she knew more about me than anyone in that house, and she never once made me feel like a burden. Gerald fired her without notice after she asked for a raise. 8 years, $3 an hour, no notice. I was 15, and I didn't know how to stop it, and I didn't know how to find her afterward because he had deleted her contact from the house phone. That is the kind of childhood that produces a very specific adult, the kind who learns to need nothing out loud, who learns that love is a transaction, and she had better stay current on payments. It also produces the kind of adult who is very good at building things alone. I went to college on loans and a partial scholarship and a work-study job in the chemistry department. Gerald co-signed the loans. He mentioned this the way people mention things they consider debts, not once, loudly, but regularly, quietly, in contexts where it landed like a hand on the back of your neck. Just a reminder of what the arrangement was. I studied computer science because it was a language with consistent rules, and I had grown up in a house where the rules changed depending on who needed what. I graduated, got a job at a health tech startup in San Diego doing imaging algorithm work. I was good at the work, very good, in the way that people who have been invisible their whole lives are sometimes very good at things no one is watching them do. I kept my head down and built things, and after 2 years, I started building things on my own time, in my apartment, late at night, that were better than what we were doing at the office. I did not tell anyone about that. During this same period, I was becoming, gradually, and without formally agreeing to it, the family's financial backstop. It started small. Gerald's shop had good years and bad years, and during the bad years, Gerald had a way of calling that didn't sound like a request. He'd call to share that the quarter was rough. He'd call to share that Renee's wedding was coming up and things were tight. And then there would be a pause, and in the pause was the entire expectation, and I would fill it because I had been filling pauses my entire life. Co-signed his shop's second lease at 22, $5,000 toward a slow order at 24, $1,200 for Renee's bridal shower, which I was not invited to attend, but which I was asked to help fund because the family wanted it to be nice. I bought a gift card, mailed it to an address in Corona, never heard whether it arrived. $8,000 toward a roof repair at 26. Gerald had refinanced the house twice by then. I had $243 in my checking account after that transfer. I did not tell anyone. I had learned that showing the actual balance was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities got used. Also at 26, I did not get a card for my master's degree graduation. Gerald had promised to come and then called 2 days before to say Renee's baby shower had been scheduled for the same weekend. He sent a text. "We'll celebrate next time, kiddo." There was no next time. There never was. I sat in the parking lot of a Whole Foods after the ceremony in my gown, and I cried. The kind that uses up something. 30 minutes, alone. I did not call anyone because there was no one who knew enough about the whole picture to understand what I was grieving. The work kept going. The late nights in the apartment kept going. A research contact passed my imaging algorithm to a team in Boston who asked to see a demo. I did the demo in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a pressed shirt above the frame and sweatpants below it. They called back in 4 days. There were lawyers. There was a Pasadena office building that smelled like burnt coffee. I drove home afterward in the same CRV and stopped at the same Trader Joe's and bought the same things I always bought. 8 figures in an account I had opened specifically for this, under an LLC I had registered in Delaware 6 months earlier because my lawyer said I should. I kept the CRV, kept the old navy jeans, kept showing up to Renee's gender reveals with a Target gift card and a casserole. The moment I stopped being the broke stepdaughter, I would lose the only role they'd cast me in. I wasn't ready for the fight yet. I bought the Cliff House 8 months later. Cash through the LLC, Big Sur, 3 acres. Pool deck with heated travertine, long teak table on a stone terrace. The Pacific 200 feet below, cold and absolute and mine. No one in my family knew this house existed. The text changed everything. I did not scroll to my friends. I scrolled to the people Gerald had cut out of my life one by one over 20 years, like a man pruning a bonsai down to the shape of his own ego. I started with Carol. I had kept her number through every phone change, the way you keep certain numbers as their own kind of refusal. I hadn't called it in 5 years. It rang 4 times and she picked up. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, a television on in the background. A Saturday afternoon, and my Aunt Carol was watching television alone in her rental in Bakersfield. I said her name. "Ben, it's Ren. I want to fly you to Big Sur for Easter. I want to tell you about my mom. I want you to see where I live." The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if the call dropped. Then I heard the specific quality of silence that isn't silence, someone holding a sound in. Carol had been trying not to cry since she heard my voice, and she stopped trying now. She cried for several minutes. I let her. I had learned what it was to be on the other end of a phone call you had stopped letting yourself hope would come, and I knew what she needed was not comfort or words or managed silence. She needed to cry. I owed her those minutes. When she came back, she said, "I'm sorry," and I said, "Please don't be." And she said, "I have missed you so much," and I said, "I know," and we were both crying, and it was the good kind. The kind that releases a pressure you had stopped noticing because you had carried carried it so long. She said yes before I finished explaining where Big Sir was. I called my grandfather next. He answered on the second ring. At 84, he still answered phones fast, with the urgency of someone who grew up before voicemail. I said, Grandpa, it's Ren. I want you to come to Big Sir for Easter. I want you to bring your cap. A short pause. Then, my cap? Your veteran's cap. I want you to wear it to brunch. Another pause. Then he laughed, low and slow and genuinely amused. He said he hadn't worn that cap to a family thing in 15 years. I said, that ends this Easter. He said, what did that man do now? And I said, I'll tell you everything when you get here. And he said, I'll be there. I called Marisol. She answered mid-ring and I said her name and she screamed. Not in alarm. The scream you make when something warm touches you after a long cold time. She screamed and said, oh my God, mija, oh my God. And we spent 4 minutes in laughter and tears before we managed actual conversation. She was in Fresno, working at a bakery she described as small but nice. She had not heard from the family in 6 years. She had thought about me many times. I told her I was flying her to Big Sur, first class, sending a car. She said, mija, I can't let you do that. I said, Marisol, I built software in my apartment and sold it to a company in Boston, and I have 3 acres on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, and I am going to feed you lamb and champagne on Easter Sunday, and you are going to let me. Silence. Then, lamb? I said, the best lamb you've ever had. And she said, I'll bring the rice. And I said, please bring the rice. I called my mother's best friend Patricia, my godmother on paper, frozen out so completely I had assumed for a while she was dead. I'd found her Facebook at 22 and stared at her profile without clicking follow, too afraid she wouldn't remember me. I called the number I found through a white pages search. She answered out of breath, like she'd been in another room. Patricia, this is Ren, Claire's daughter. The intake of breath was audible. Then, honey. Oh, honey. And then, is this a goodbye thing? I had to laugh. No, I said. This is a hello thing. I am more okay than I have ever been. I want you to come to Easter brunch and I want you to tell me everything you remember about my mother. She said she would have been so proud of you. I said, I'm starting to let myself believe that. I called 8 more after that. My mother's college roommate, who had been sending me birthday cards with handwritten memories of my mom for 23 years. A cousin on my mother's side, Gerald had excised from holidays by simply never including her in the invitations. Rosa Maldonado, whose family Gerald had sued in 2009 over an 18-inch strip of grass because he liked having a lawyer on retainer, and who said when I called, we always wondered what happened to you. And I didn't have words for how much that sentence cost me to hear. Eddie the contractor, who had delivered meals to my grandfather for 2 years during a period of limited mobility and never told anyone. 11 total. 8 said yes immediately. 2 said yes after they stopped crying. Patricia said, are you sure? Are you sure I'm not intruding? And I told her she was the point of the whole thing. She got quiet and said your mother would have done exactly this. I know, I said. I got it from her. I booked 11 first-class flights, sent town cars, had a stylist drive to Carol's rental in Bakersfield because she'd mentioned, lightly, that she hadn't bought anything new in 2 years, had a tailor visit my grandfather in Modesto, called the chef I keep on retainer, Margaret, who used to run a Michelin-starred kitchen in Carmel, and told her I needed her best Easter brunch for 12 people. Lamb, champagne so cold it hurt your teeth, strawberries the size of your fist. These were the most important guests I had ever hosted. I also hired a photographer. Her name was Sloan. She understood, from the kind of work she did, that sometimes photographs were not just memories. Sometimes they were evidence. While I was doing all of this, Gerald sent 3 more texts. We miss you. Renee was hoping you could Venmo her $400 for the baby's Easter outfit. She's stretched thin. Don't be weird about the brunch thing. It's just easier this way. I read all 3. I did not reply. I kept booking. Easter Sunday arrived quietly, with fog sitting on the water like a sleeping animal and cold air that smelled like salt and eucalyptus. I woke at 6, made coffee, walked the property while the light was still gray and the Pacific was lat pewter below me. Margaret arrived at 7 with 2 assistants and 3 crates of ingredients. The florist at 7:30 with white ranunculus and lemon branches and eucalyptus arranged in low centerpieces so nothing blocked the sightlines. Sloan arrived at 8 with 2 cameras and walked the terrace and the pool deck and said, this is extraordinary, and I said, I know. And she began. Carol was the first to arrive. The town car came up the crushed shell drive at 9:45, and I was standing at the top of it when it pulled in. Not inside waiting, not delegating to anyone, but there, present, in my own body, at the top of my own driveway. Carol stepped onto the gravel. She was wearing a blue dress in the stylist's work. She looked up at the house. She put one hand on her chest. She said, oh, sweetheart. Then she walked up and hugged me, and we stood there in the gravel for a long time, and neither of us said anything because there wasn't anything to say that would be as accurate as just standing there. She pulled back, looked at my face, and said, you look like your mother. I cried, just for a moment, the good kind. My grandfather arrived in his new suit, charcoal wool the tailor had made it properly, and his Vietnam veteran's cap set straight on his head. He walked with a cane now, something I hadn't known because I hadn't seen him in 4 years, and seeing the cane undid something in my chest, but his eyes were the same. He looked at the property, the house, the terrace, the ocean beyond it. He looked at me. He said, Rennie, what did you build? I said, everything I could. He put his arm around me, and I felt his hand thin and dry and exactly right on my shoulder. And I thought about Saturday ice cream cones and VHS Disney movies and a cat that had been forbidden from tables for 15 years. Marisol arrived and didn't so much step out of the car as spill from it, out the door before it fully stopped, covering the distance between us and the fast walk of a woman who has been wanting to do something for a long time. She grabbed my face in both hands. She looked at me. She said, Mija, you did it. You actually did it. I said, you haven't seen the kitchen yet. She said, show me the kitchen. She ran her hands hands over the countertops with the expression of a carpenter looking at good joinery. She approved. Then she produced from her bag a container of her rice and handed it to Margaret with instructions in rapid Spanish. Margaret listened with complete attention and executed the instructions perfectly. The rice was the best thing on the table. Patricia arrived carrying a leather satchel and looking at 68, like a woman who had decided comfort and elegance were not mutually exclusive. She stopped at the front step, looked at me for a long time, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a small wrapped package. I've been carrying this for 6 years, waiting for a reason. A photograph. My mother, 26 years old, laughing in a kitchen I didn't recognize, holding a glass of wine. On the back, in Patricia's handwriting, Claire, July 1991, trying to teach me to make her mother's arroz con pollo. She couldn't stop laughing long enough to explain the recipe. She kept saying, "You'll figure it out." I never did. I held it for a long time. Then I put it in my pocket and said, "Come have champagne." The rest arrived over the following hour. Rosa Maldonado and her daughter Elena, my mother's college roommate, who brought every card she'd ever sent me in a rubber-banded bundle and set it on the table without comment. My cousin Diane, with my mother's exact green eyes. Eddie, the contractor. The 2 women from my mother's church who cried when they saw me and said things about her I would be turning over for years. By 11 o'clock, we were 12 people on a stone terrace 50 miles from the nearest stoplight. The fog had burned off. The Pacific was the color of something from a painting. My grandfather was in a chair in the sun with Marisol beside him, telling her something that made him laugh, his slow, low laugh. Carol was at the railing with a champagne glass, looking at the water. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. I thought about the 9-year-old in the dress her grandmother bought. I tried to send that girl this moment. I don't know if it works that way. I hope it does. We sat down at noon, my grandfather on my right, Carol on my left. Marisol made a toast in Spanish that ended with mija. The food was extraordinary. The champagne was exactly as cold as I had promised. The rice was, as I said, the best thing on the table. Conversations overlapped and wove together the way good table conversations do. My grandfather told a story about Vietnam I had never heard. Patricia told 3 stories about my mother I had never heard. Marisol told the story of the morning I was 10 and had burned oatmeal, and she arrived to find me eating dry cereal from the box with great dignity, and everyone laughed, including me, loudly, and I thought, this is what a table is actually for. Sloane was very good. She got all of it. She got my grandfather laughing with his cap tilted. She got Marisol and Margaret shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen doorway. She got the wide shot of all 12 guests with the ocean behind them. And she got a moment I didn't know she was capturing. My grandfather's hand over mine on the table, his eyes full of the thing I have only seen in old photographs of my mother, his cap in frame. That photograph is in my entryway now. It's the first thing I see when I walk into my house. After dessert, I stood up, picked up my phone, and posted 9 photographs. Short caption, the cruelest ones always are. Easter brunch with the people who actually showed up. To the Blood family celebrating somewhere else. I hope the 22K buys something nice. Tagged his shop, tagged Renee, hit post, put my phone face down on the linen, and went back for strawberries. 11 minutes, 57 missed calls. I know the 11-minute gap because I checked later. The missed call log scrolls and scrolls. Gerald, Renee, Gerald, an unknown number, Renee twice more, and the timestamps tell the whole story. The first 3 calls were 4 minutes apart. The next 5 were 60 seconds apart. After that, it was continuous. The kind of calling that is not about reaching someone, but about performing distress at a screen. I did not answer any of them. I played the voicemails at the table. That was deliberate. My guests deserved to hear them. The people who had been cut out, frozen out, managed out of my life deserved to hear the soundtrack of the family that had done it. Voicemail 1, Gerald doing his deal voice. The measured one he used with difficult customers. Ren, sweetheart, there's been a misunderstanding. Take the post down and we'll talk like adults. 14 minutes later, the deal voice was gone. You have no idea what you've started. Renee's mother-in-law has been calling her for 2 hours. Take it down, right now. The arc from there was consistent. Volume increasing, the specifics shifting, but the core constant. You have embarrassed this family. You did this on purpose, which was accurate, and you will regret this, which remained to be seen. Renee's voicemail was later and loud. You tagged Marisol? She's the housekeeper, Ren. My mother-in-law, and then something I couldn't make out. Then, is that a vineyard behind her? Why is there a vineyard? My grandfather, listening, said quietly, there's no vineyard. I said, I know. That's the olive grove on the neighboring property. He said, she thinks an olive grove is a vineyard? I said, Renee has never looked at an olive tree. He laughed his low, slow laugh. Carol had been listening with an expression I didn't recognize at first, then understood. It was the face of a woman watching a long-held belief confirmed. She had always known what Gerald was. She had been told for years she was wrong about it, and she was watching now, the evidence that she had been right. Marisol didn't say anything during the voicemails. She sat with her hands around her champagne glass and listened with her head slightly tilted, the way she used to listen when I was a kid and wanted me to know she was hearing all of it. When the last one ended, she said in Spanish and then in English, you were always worth more than they said. I just waited a long time to stop believing them. Patricia raised her glass and said she'd like to make a toast. She said my mother used to say the best revenge was a table full of people who loved you. She thought this qualified. We all drank to that. We moved from the table in the natural post-meal drift of a good gathering, the conversations getting quieter and more specific, the kind that only happen when people are full and warm, and something that had been held tight has started to release. Carol told me about my mother's 20s, things I had never known, that she had briefly considered art school, that she was a terrible driver, that she once convinced Carol to drive 5 hours to see a band they both loved, and the band canceled, and they'd spent the whole trip in the parking lot of a Denny's laughing about it. My grandfather fell asleep in a lounge chair in the afternoon sun, cap on, hands folded. Marisol found a blanket and covered him, and he slept for 40 minutes. When he woke, he looked around at the terrace and the ocean and said, "I was dreaming about your grandmother. She says hello." I said, "Tell her I'm working on it." He said, "She knows." The afternoon moved through golden into long. Goodbyes lasted, the kind where you hug twice and start a sentence and finish it in the driveway and hug again at the car. Carol held my face in her hands at the town car door and said, "I'll see you next month." I said, "I already bought the ticket." She blinked. "You already bought it?" "I already bought it." She got in the car, kept looking at me through the window as it moved down the drive until the curve took her from view. I sat on the terrace in the late light and watched the Pacific and thought about nothing for a while. Nowhere I needed to be, no one I needed to manage. Then, at 9:15, my security system pinged. Front gate, 2 figures at the call box. I had been expecting this. Not necessarily on Easter night itself, but I had known, in the quiet part of my mind that had been preparing for 16 weeks, that they would not absorb this quietly. There is a phenomenon in behavioral psychology called an extinction burst. What happens when an animal that has always been rewarded for a behavior stops receiving the reward? The animal doesn't stop. It escalates, pressing harder and faster and with more desperation, because its brain cannot process that the rule has changed. Gerald had been pressing the Ren lever for 22 years. The lever had stopped working. I put on my coat and my slippers and walked down the long, crushed shell drive. The security feed showed a rental SUV idling at my gate, headlights washing the wrought iron. Gerald was gripping the bars the way a man grips them when the gripping has moved from purposeful to helpless. Renee was behind him, holding a manila envelope with the grip of someone who believes it is a weapon. They had flown from the Inland Empire to Monterey on Easter Sunday, rented a car, driven Highway 1 in the dark, 90 miles of cliffside road, hairpin turns, no guardrails, to stand at my gate because of an Instagram post. I want you to sit with what that says about who was actually in distress in this family. The air was cold. The Pacific was loud in the dark below. I walked slowly. I had decided that morning if they came, I would walk slowly. There was no urgency. I was not afraid. Gerald had been crying. I could see the dried streaks in the headlights. He looked smaller than I remembered, heavier, wearing an outlet mall travel jacket. And for the first time in my life, he looked like what he was. A man in his late 50s who had spent his whole life getting things from people and had recently discovered the source had dried up. He started with, "Ren, honey, misunderstanding, need to take down the post. Renee's mother-in-law has been calling all day. Her marriage shouldn't have to suffer for this." I said, "Stop." He stopped. I said, "You drove 200 miles to my gate to demand I take down a post on Easter night. Think about what that says about who is actually in control here and who isn't." Renee stepped forward and pulled the document from the envelope and held it up in the headlights. The notary stamp was visible. She said, "Do you remember signing this when you were 17? I remembered. A household responsibility agreement, Gerald had called it. Signed at the kitchen table in front of a notary named Gary, a friend from the Elks Lodge who lost his commission in 2014 for forging seals. I had signed it with a big pen because I wanted the cosign done so I could submit my FAFSA. Renee read, "Any income, intellectual property, or assets generated by the undersigned during their period of dependent residence in the family home shall be considered communal property of the family unit and shall not be alienated without consent of the head of household." She lowered the paper. She smiled. Gerald's smile. All teeth, no warmth. She said, "You wrote the imaging code in our garage, on our internet. That code is family property. Half of it is mine, half is Dad's. We need you to sign a quitclaim on this house and wire us the licensing income tonight, or we sue." She pushed the document through the bars. I let it fall to the gravel. I said, "I want to show you something." I pulled out my phone and turned the screen to face them. I said, "The 22,000. You told the family it was a gift, Dad. Told Renee at the baby shower it was a loan." Read the recipient line. He squinted through the bars. The recipient was not him. It was a commercial finance company in Riverside. He went very still. I said, "Your shop's note has been held by that company since November. The bank wanted the loan off their books before year end. The 22,000 wasn't your payment. It was my closing cost. I bought your lien in February. I own the note on your shop, your equipment, your inventory, and the strip of land it sits on, through an LLC whose name you wouldn't recognize. I was going to let you keep it. I was going to let you ride out the year and never tell you because somewhere I still loved you." I tapped the phone. I said, "I just lifted the forbearance." Then I turned to Renee. "The contract, signed by a minor in California, where the legal age for that category of asset transfer is 18. Missing the specific consideration California requires for intellectual property clauses, notarized by a man who lost his commission for forging seals. I had a lawyer pull it apart in 20 minutes. It is worth less than the paper it's printed on." Then I said, "And one more thing." I pulled up a second screen. The family house, refinanced twice. The equity line used, among other things, to pay for Renee's engagement ring. Gerald had missed a payment in January, another in February. The mortgage was held by a regional credit union in San Bernardino with very low tolerance for consecutive misses. I had been in contact with their special assets desk since the second missed payment. I closed on that note this morning, 7 a.m. Pacific. That is why I poured myself a martini at brunch. I said, "I own your father's house, Renee. I own his shop. I own the equity line. As of the notice I just sent, all three are in acceleration." The headlights of the SUV were the only sound. Gerald had sat down on the gravel. He was sitting there in his outlet mall jacket with his head in his hands. Renee was standing with her mouth open and the envelope at her side, and her chin was no longer up. She said in the smallest voice I had ever heard her use, "Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at her, at Gerald on the gravel, at the moon coming up over the cliffs behind them. I said, "You told me at brunch you wanted just blood family. I'm not not blood, Renee. I never was. I was the wallet. I was the co-signer. I was the step-kid allowed at the table when the math required it. I said, so go find your blood family. Maybe they have a couch. Maybe they'll do for you what I did for 22 years. I turned to Hector. I said, please escort them off the property. Then I turned around and walked back up the drive. Behind me, Renee started screaming about lawyers, about Easter, about family and God, and how I would regret this. She screamed my name. I did not turn around. I had been turning around for them my entire life. That was finished. When I got back to the great room, Carol was in the doorway. She had heard everything. Her eyes were full of something I didn't recognize for a moment and then understood. Pride. Uncomplicated, complete, maternal pride. She said, come inside. It's cold. My grandfather was on the couch. He looked at me and said, you okay, Rennie? I said, yeah, Pop, I'm okay. He held out his arm and I sat next to him, and Marisol brought 3 mugs of cocoa, and we sat there and watched the moon move over the water, and no one said much because nothing needed saying. Hector texted at 10:43, rental SUV confirmed heading north on 1. Later, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I went to the pool deck. The same deck where I'd stood 12 hours earlier reading the text. The hummingbird was gone. The Pacific was loud below me, and the moon was on the water, and I opened the family group chat. 15 years of birthday messages that were really requests. Holiday photos I hadn't been included in. I did not write a goodbye. I just deleted the chat. Then I stood there and listened to the Pacific and thought about my mother. I thought about a woman who kept reading out loud after I fell asleep, just in case I could still hear it. I thought about what she would have made of the table and the cap and the photograph and the gravel and all of it. I thought, this one was for you. In the weeks after Easter, I thought a lot about the math of what happened, not gloating, in the honest, analytical way I think about most things, trying to understand what caused what was inevitable. Gerald missed 9 consecutive payments on his shop note. Those misses were not bad luck. They were not a slow quarter. They were the compounded result of 30 years of choices about money and about people, that I had been absorbing on his behalf for over a decade. Every time I filled a gap, I delayed the moment his choices became unavoidable. When I stopped filling gaps, there was nothing between him and 30 years of consequences. That is not karma in the mystical sense. It is cause and effect running its course. Renee had a contract she had genuinely believed, would checkmate me. I think she had been holding it for a long time, since she suspected I had built something significant as her insurance policy. She had never had a lawyer look at it, because looking at it would require admitting she planned to use it. She brought it to my gate on Easter night, and by then it was too late. A woman who built her security on a foundation she never bothered to test. My grandfather moved into the guest cottage 6 weeks after Easter. His mobility had gotten difficult enough that living alone in Modesto was becoming a risk. He arrived with 4 boxes and his Vietnam cap and a framed photograph of my grandmother that went on the cottage mantle. Every morning I make 2 cups of coffee and walk down the path, and we sit on the cottage porch and look at the water. He talks about my grandmother. He tells me, sometimes, the real parts of the war, not the story parts, the ones he only trusts to people he has known long enough. He told me 3 weeks after he moved in that he had thought about me every year since I stopped being at Christmas. He had thought about calling. He had been afraid I had been turned against him. I told him I had never been turned against him. The opposite. He said, I know. That's why I knew it was real when you called. Carol flies out once a month. She stays in the second guest room I furnished with her in mind. A full bookshelf, a good reading lamp, blue bedding she had mentioned once in passing that she liked. She arrives on Fridays, and we have a standing routine. She talks about my mother, and I ask questions, and she answers all of them. We are slowly building a portrait of a woman I lost before I knew what to ask. My mother could not parallel park under any circumstances and found it genuinely funny. She had strong opinions about fonts. She once drove 5 hours with Carol to see a band they loved. The band canceled, and they spent the whole trip in a Denny's parking lot laughing. Carol says she kept saying it was the best concert she never saw. Patricia sends photographs by mail. She has been going through her own archives and pulling everything with my mother in it and sending them in padded envelopes with notes in her small, careful handwriting on the backs. My mother at 23 in Patricia's kitchen. My mother at 27 holding me in what appears to be a hospital room, looking at the camera with an expression I have spent a long time looking at. She looks like she has just understood something enormous. Marisol and I talk twice a week. She is teaching me, via video call, my mother's recipes, the specific techniques my mother had inherited from her own mother and never written down anywhere. Marisol had watched my mother cook for years and committed it all to memory with the thoroughness of someone who understood these things needed preserving. We are working on the arroz con leche. We are working on the green sauce my mother made every Christmas that I thought I had lost forever. I have not spoken to Gerald or Renee since Easter night. There is nothing left to say. Lawyers have communicated what needs to be communicated. I have made choices about the notes, choices more generous than Gerald deserves, and those choices are mine, made on my own timeline, and I am taking my time. There are days I miss something. Not them. I want to be honest. I miss the idea of a father. The years when I still believed, with the specific hopefulness of a child who has already lost too much, that the man who came after my mother died was going to be the kind of man who showed up. I miss that belief itself, even knowing it was never going to come true. But here is what I have now. A table with 12 chairs and a guest cottage with a coffee porch and a Sunday phone call and padded envelopes arriving every few weeks, and a voice teaching me my mother's recipes twice a week, and a man in a Vietnam veteran's cap who drinks his coffee looking at the water and tells me I remind him of a girl he knew in 1968. That is solid ground. The first solid ground I have ever had. I think my mother would have found Gerald out immediately. She was sharp and clear-eyed inside and she understood what people were doing even when they were trying to hide it. I think she would have ended it before it started. I think I have spent 20 years living the consequences of the fact that she didn't get to. And then I think, but here I am anyway, on the other side of it. With her sister and her father and her best friend at my table and her recipes in my hands and the Pacific below me and a life that is entirely, completely, inarguably mine. The table is the point, not the gate, not the forbearance notice, not the contract on the gravel. Those are just the mechanics of how a thing ends. The ending is not the point. The point is Carol's hand on her chest in the driveway, my grandfather's cap in the photograph, Marisol's rice, Patricia saying she'd been carrying something for 6 years, waiting for a reason to give it. The point is that every person on that terrace had been there the whole time. In Bakersfield, in Modesto, in Fresno, in Oregon, sending birthday cards and keeping photographs and waiting for a phone call they were no longer sure would come. I turned on the light. They had been waiting in the dark.